So it looks like this Dune survival MMO from Funcom is going to be on a different timeline than the books or the films that are currently in the middle of releasing right now, which is very interesting because I think some people had looked at it and were wondering, is this going to be a straight adaptation? Is this going to be, book, are they basing it off the film? Because they've said that they're basing it off the film and the books, the Denis Villeneuve films, the new ones, and the books. So from what I understand, it is they're going with the book for the lore, but they're going with the visuals of the films and blending those two together. But we got confirmation today. This is the second of the articles that I've come across over at PC Gamer. So they're starting to do some press around this game, which leads me to think that maybe it actually is coming out in 2023, or maybe it's coming into early access or something soon. I'm not sure. But the creative director, Joel Bylos, has done a series of interviews now at PC Gamer. I covered one earlier this morning, actually, and he's got a second one up where he talks about it's taking place in an alternate timeline where they're going to see familiar things that they'd expect, but as part of an alternate history. And before everybody freaks out, he does say in this interview, we worked closely with the Herbert family and Legendary Pictures and found a single point, a single pebble that starts a landslide in terms of it being similar to the books, but with an alternate history, a sort of what if you want. I mean, I'm still intrigued. Like, I think I like the way that this sounds because they had to do something similar, um, not entirely the same, but something similar with Lord of the Rings Online when they were building that game because you're dealing with characters in a book series that pass in a certain way, and you somewhat have to respect those timelines, but in other cases, you can completely throw those timelines out the window because you want players to be able to interact with the characters from the books because that's part of the draw that's going to bring them to the games is to have these familiar faces. So he actually talks about in this interview how using the Duke Leto example. You will be able to interact with and work with and for Duke Leto, and they say that it picks up around 8 years after the events of the book. So it's very interesting because they're obviously playing around with who's still alive at a certain point in time. So no, they can't talk about what that pebble moment is. But let's just dive into this real quick. It says here the point Bylos said represents a sort of where if just this one thing was different in the universe, then it would change a lot of what comes after and change it in a way that makes for more of a virtual world kind of experience where players can see all the familiar things that they'd expect to see. And while he couldn't talk about what the specifics of the Pebble of Story was, he said he couldn't talk about it. The change is meant to allow players in Dune Awakening to interact with characters from the books they otherwise wouldn't be able to because a lot of the major characters die early on in the story. He says if you've seen the first movie, you can expect many of those characters to exist in the story of the game. I could give you an example that's very clear. Duke Leto is still alive. You can meet Duke Leto. So I'm actually, I can kind of get down for this because this is one of the reasons why I'm never a purist when it comes to something being adapted, and that's probably just because of my experience working as an author over the years and constantly changing things throughout revisions and everything else on projects and MMORPGs and video games and so on and so forth. Things are always in a state of flux until they're not, and you can always bend the rules to make something work as long as you're creative enough about it. But an adaptation is always going to cover things differently than the original source material because it's a different medium and there's just different things to consider. In a book series where you're killing off a lot of the major characters in the early parts of the book, that might be okay for that book experience because it's very linear. It's one person reading the book going through that experience. But we have a virtual world and everyone's wanting to interact with these characters, you have to figure out a way. Well, how do we make that happen? Do we extend these characters? Do we give them an alternate timeline as they did here? Do we give them alternate stories? Do we set the game in an earlier time period? There's lots of ways to do things. So I'm very interested in what they're doing here. He does say that Leo Atreides doesn't survive long on Arrakis, certainly not until the year 199 AG. Where does he talk about this? Somewhere up earlier, he said. All right, Dune Awakening is set in the year 10,199 AG, which is about 8 years after the events of the film that came out in 2021. But it says in the MMO, the events don't quite play out the same way people familiar with the books or films remember them. I'm okay with that. This is an adaptation for me. So it's kind of like when I went and played the Shadow of Mordor games. That's what they're called. The two Mordor war games they made, and a lot of people were like, they played so fast and loose with the lore. I'm never gonna play those games because it ruins Tolkien's legacy. I never looked at it like that. I just went, it's a video game set in Middle Earth about a interesting character they've conceived of. Got some cool gameplay mechanics where you can control orcs and stuff, and I just played it as a very entertaining series of games, and it was highly enjoyable. And so I'm looking forward to Dune Awakening sort of being in the same vein of that for me. I'm still, again, nervous about the fact that it's a survival game, but after reading the article that I read yesterday, which I covered in this morning's video on the game, I'm a little less nervous about it now because they're obviously not trying to force death down your throat if you don't want to eat your food or you don't want to drink your water. You're like, it's not like your character's going to die. Obviously, you'll have some, you know, suffering effects or whatever, but you're not going to really find your play ruined if you aren't paying attention to the survival elements, which is fine for me. I'm still nervous about the PvP. I need to know more about the PvP before I can truly get excited about this game. But I'm liking the interviews that I'm seeing here. It's an interesting enough sounding project that it's maintaining my current level of interest and maybe even, you know, I don't want to say it's making me hyped, but it is keeping me engaged. Like they're coming out with continual new press now, which has constantly got me going, oh, that looks cool. That's interesting. Well, you guys are making progress. This looks all right, awesome, you know. Now I'm just kind of inching. They're doing a good job of saturation, is what I'm getting at. So kudos to them. Check it out if you haven't already. Check out the video from this morning. I think it was the one that came out at 8 a.m. Today's the 28th of February. So go through and read this at your leisure. I've got the link to this down below. There's another piece of concept art here, which I don't think I saw the second one yesterday. The first one is obviously this one. But let's take a look at this second one too, because this first one I thought was really cool. But this one also, I didn't see this one yesterday, but I'm a sucker for concept art. So shipwreck interior concept art, Funcom Oslo AS, all rights reserved. Tasty stuff here. Um, Says here, beyond just meeting Leto, players may get a chance to align themselves with the famous Duke. The idea is that the players will make choices about who they help or want to work with later in the game, says Bylos, the creative director. So if you're meeting Duke Leto, you've clearly done the right thing for a certain group of people, and you've obviously jumped through a lot of hoops. So it's that kind of angle. Huh. While Lito was, I'm sure, sorry guys, I paused for a minute reading this. He says, like another Funcom online multiplayer survivor game, Conan Exiles, Bylos says Dune Awakening will be building out things further and further after launch, so more and more characters will show up over time. So I think we can expect to see, assuming this gets the launch that they're hoping for, it's going to be a project they're working on for years to come. Again, I still just need it to not be forced. If it's not forced PvP, if it's kind of like I really appreciated the way they did New World, where it was consensual PvP, only if you wanted to do it over there for those specific events. The rest of the game was run around, explore, do quests, harvest, craft in a PvE environment. If they could pull that off and not have it be forced PvP or non-consensual PvP, I'm going to be all over this game when it launches because it's Dune. I love Dune. Anyway, another great article. Take your time, read it at leisure. Let me know what you think. Until next time, stay safe, everybody. Happy gaming. Happy reading also.